Hey guys, so welcome to the first of many mixing processes that I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to be doing some of these for my Patreon. I'm going to be doing some of them for the YouTube channel, and I'm just going to be breaking down the mixes that I'm doing and just kind of working along as I'm mixing a track and kind of explaining what I'm doing. I'm currently living in Thailand for a month right now before I go to Vietnam and Bali, also for a month each, and visiting Singapore for a day. So it's been kind of hectic trying to get the recordings done properly. I actually have a pretty interesting setup going on right now. My microphone stand won't clip to anything in my hotel room, so I actually had to use a garbage can and weigh it down with a water bottle to try and weigh it enough that I can clamp the microphone stand to it. And you're gonna hear some background noise because I am in a hotel right next to a very busy street, and there's nowhere else I can record inside of the hotel that is much quieter. So I'm just going to try my best to talk over the mix and talk over the volume of the cars going around. So anyways, what I've done so far is I've exported all my stems for the most part. This is a remix that I'm doing, but I'm just doing this pretty heavy progressive remix, and I have pretty much all my stems and the remix stems right here. And the reason we want to export stems is so that we can not only see the waveforms and kind of see what we're missing. Like, I wouldn't be able to tell maybe this transient's a little bit offset here. And you can see, the spikes and transients and stuff, and it helps us with a visual, as well as it drastically reduces the CPU. And you can see right here, I only have 3 CPU. That's going to fluctuate a little bit because I am using some recording software as well. We might get a couple underruns, but that's okay. We're just going to do with what I have here. And I guess we can start. I've routed the stems to my mixer channel here. And I've taken off all the effects before I've exported, and I've reintroduced the effects now. So the effects don't get changed into the exporting. And the track isn't 100% done, I don't believe. So I think that I might have to go back into the original project and make some changes. But then I just re-export, and then I re-implement the wave files back onto here, so I don't have to constantly go back and forth. Right, let's get started. I already have done this video before, but unfortunately the video crashed, so I have done a little bit of mixing. All that I did so far was just the kick and bass, and I started introducing some of the drums. And that's about it. So I've also wanted to mention that I am mixing in mono, and the reason we want to mix in mono is because we want to eliminate the stereo enhancement issues from the beginning. So we don't want to run into any stereo enhancement issues later on down the road. We want to make sure that we are focusing on them before, so we don't want to mix down to mono later on and lose a bunch of our information due to phase cancellation, etc. So let's just continue on then, I guess. Gotta turn that one down for sure. I haven't done any compression or anything like that for the most part. Maybe some light compression on when I was writing, but nothing too drastic. I want to find out what that loud noise was. I think it was this guy right here. Go to that part of the track and let's hear that. Yeah, it was that one right there. I believe my clap comes in right here, so I'm just going to turn up the clap. I do think that my kick needs to be a bit punchier. I'm going to get back to that later. One thing that I suggest you do when you're mixing your tracks is, instead of looking at the faders while you're rising them, you might be biased to where you think it should sit. So if you've written 10 tracks and mixed 10 tracks, and your clap usually sits around -5.5, and your fader usually sits around here, you might be biased and think that even though it sounds a little bit better, a little bit louder, or a little bit quieter, you might think, it's probably just my ears tricking me. I know that my last few tracks have had 5.5. So you put it to 5.5. That's not always the case. You want to be using your ears first before your visuals, and then using your visuals to reference after. So what we can do is just drag the fader all the way down, and then you can either look somewhere else or close your eyes, and then just start playing the track, and slowly start raising up the clap, or whatever fader. Make sure it's actually coming in. I guess I should turn on my buses. Oh, and I should mention too, I have these 4 buses here. So if I forget anything, it's because I've already recorded this once, like I said, and I just want to make sure I'm covering everything. So that I have my kick. My kick is going directly into the master. It's also being sent to the bass bus so that I can use sidechaining on the bass bus. The sidechain bus that I have here is essentially every synth and effect that I have that I'll be using a compressor for sidechain compression on it. So I route all my synths into the sidechain bus, and then the sidechain bus goes directly into the master, and then I have my drum bus. So all my drums go into the drum bus and then into the master. And then my bass, obviously my bass bus is my bass synths. Just so you can have better control over everything. You can compress everything together. You can use reverbs on the whole buses, etc. Just wanted to point that out. And then we'll go back to the clap here. So I also have my clap and snare usually go into a bus as well, so I can compress them together if I do layer up my clap and snare. That sounds good, but for the sake of the example, I'm gonna turn it down and try again. So I'm gonna look away and I'm just gonna increase until I think it sounds really good. There. Let's hear again with the rest of the context. Maybe a bit loud for right now. I think my hats need to go louder too. So I'm gonna turn the whole drum bus up for a little. And then I'm gonna turn this up, turn my clap down a little bit. Let's hear how that sounds. Cool. I think the drums need to be a little bit punchier, but I'll come back to that. Maybe I'll turn up this hat here a little bit. I don't think that's right. Yeah, I compress that later so it sounds a little bit better. Yeah, it's definitely taking off a bit. There we go, a little bit punchier. Okay, next we're going to move on to this one here, tambourine. I'm going to apply the same process. I'm going to slowly turn it up without looking. I'm actually going to get to a different part of the song here. After the breakdown and build up. Okay, start from the bottom. Okay, and now when I look at it, I see it's almost maxed out, so I can adjust that later with maybe a limiter or a compressor and increase the gain. For now, I'm just going to leave it like that because we're going to compress everything after. When I mix, I like to do mostly my gain staging first. I like to get all the levels pretty accurately set, and then come back after and start to adjust with compression and things like that, so that we're not relying on the compressors to turn everything up. We're getting in the mix as balanced as possible, and then use the compressors to find out what we want to punch through the mix a little bit better. Okay, tambourine sounds pretty good to me. So let's go to the next one, the percussion. A little bit hard to hear. Oh, and I can see here that I'm actually not routing to the drum bus. I'm routing to the master, so I'm going to turn that off and turn that onto the drum bus there. And it's also going to this delayed reverb. This is these are my sends here. I have my short drum reverb, my long drum reverb, a synth reverb, and delay. And this is just to keep all the reverbs and delays nice and organized that I want to use. If I want to use drum reverb, I can put it either to the short or long one. And this keeps it in the same room. It keeps it in the same sounding room for when you're using reverb. You have your settings here for your your diffusion, your low cut and high cut, etc. And when you have all your drums sounding in the same room, they kind of sound more coerced and glued together. If you have it sounding in two different rooms, sometimes they can kind of compete for the sound. It can kind of sound off-putting. It's very subtle, but it is something that we can consider. And then we have our synth reverb. So I can put my certain synths here to add a little bit of reverb, and the same concept where it's sounded glued together. And this way I also don't have to run 10 or 15 different reverbs, and I can save a lot of my computer usage there. So I'm going to turn down a little bit of the drum reverb, delay reverb on this one because it's a little bit prominent, and I'm going to turn down the delay feedback a little bit. And it is a bit quiet, so I'm going to just turn the limiter on, and we'll come back and we'll compress it later, but adds a little bit of swing to the track there. So I'm noticing that I'm turning up a lot of these really loud. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to grab all the drums here, and I'm going to turn them down about 1 or 2 dB. And then I'm going to turn up the drum bus a little bit. There we go. And now we have a bit more room in our faders here. A little bit quieter. Okay, and next we'll go to these. Turn down the delay a little bit. And then I want to make sure that these... Okay, so I've already monoed this hat. I'm going to mono it a little bit more. You want to make sure that you at least have one of your hi-hats monoed, and maybe your clap or your snare mono, just because you want a really important element right down the center. So I have my hat here mono. That's great. Same issue with the miscellaneous hat. I had it on master instead of drum bus. There we go. Okay, next let's start diving into the synth. So I'm just going to listen one more time to the drums, make sure they're all pretty decent levels. Sounds like there is something going to the master, this one right here. Turn that off, now it's in the sidechain. And another benefit to this is I can solo all my drums just by turning off all the other buses. So I can turn off my kick, my sidechain, and my bass, and now only the drums should play. Okay, let's go to the synths now. So I'm going to turn off my other instruments. I'm just going to start listening to some of the synths we have. So this is a synth I called R-Band. And it has a lot of delay and reverb on it. So I'm going to just turn that up and match it with the kick. I believe it should be at full volume at this point, but I'm just going to check the stem to make sure. And I've also laid out my stems, so I have my drums here, bass here, synths, and then effects. Effects, and then other synths. And I can't find... Oh, here it is. So I actually left this one in as a pattern because it is already exported as a sample here. So I just exported it into its own sample. And yep, they look like they're at full volume, so. Gonna put a little bit more reverb on it. Just a tiny bit. Okay, next one. Turn all these up a little bit so I can see when they're playing. So this one actually goes with the bass, so I'm going to put that over here. Turn this one off, and I'm going to mix this with... Just a little accent to the bass. Okay, keep going along our synths. So this one right here, I'm not sure if I'm going to keep it in the track or not. It's kind of just like a bit of a mid glue. It's kind of just filling up some of the empty space. But I put this, this is originally one of the stems, but I kept it in because it was filling up some of the empty space I had before. But now that I have a lot of other stuff going on, I might just leave it out. But for now, I'm just going to keep it in. And I want to make sure that I'm sidechaining this instrument, this sound, to my bass, because I think that it's around the same frequencies and it's going to kind of muddy up the bass a little bit, and it's going to kind of take away from the bass. So what I do is I have my bass synth, I sidechain it to here. So this is this sound, and this is my bass. So I want it to punch through those chords there, the stem that's called chords. So what I can do is turn on a compressor or a limiter, go to sidechain, and I can turn that to the bass synth. And now what happens is when the bass synth plays, I can have some sidechain compression on that. Every time the bass punches through, it's going to cut the volume of this chord. So let's hear how it sounds. So if we turn it off, it's very subtle. And on. We can go drastically just to prove the point. Let me slowly back off, just so it's very subtle, just so it's making a little bit of room for that bass to punch through. Okay. So without. What? So it just kind of fills up a little bit of that empty space in the midsection there. The lead, I'm going to leave. Actually, I'm going to put the lead now because it is very important and I want it to stand out. So I'm going to move that over closer to here because it's a more important element. I like to have my most important elements to the left going to the right. And then I'm going to turn up this lead sound. And it does change a lot throughout the song, so I'm going to let the song play out so I can make sure that it's pretty standard level. And I do have compression on already. And I'm going to go back into the original track eventually, and I'm going to try and make this lead a little bit pluckier because it is lacking a bit of that punch. I'm just going to try and do that with the compressor right now by giving it a really, really fast release so that it kind of just hopefully just hits that initial pluck and kind of makes it a little bit punchier with the slow attack time. I don't think I'm going to get much out of it, so I'm going to go back in eventually and change the stem. So we won't compress too much for now. This compressor here on the second one here is just to kind of catch the louder elements because the sound does change a lot and the power of the sound changes a lot. So I just have this one compressor here to kind of catch the high end of the high volume sounds, and then I'm going to have another compressor catching some of those as well. Just taking off very, very slight because we don't want to take away the punchiness too much. Let's hear it in the context of the track. Okay, and there is a lot of information in the EQ, so we can take some EQing after and we're going to tune that up a bit. Okay, on to our next one, our sound you can still hear. It does get a little bit lost behind the lead, I'm gonna turn up just a little bit more. And maybe we can carve out some EQ for that. Okay, going on to this little texture sound we have here. I might get rid of this perk here because we do have a lot of other perks around that sound, that frequency spectrum or frequency area. We have this crack, we have the perk here. So I'm gonna get rid of one of them eventually, but for now we'll just leave it. This is way too loud. And it's also going to the master, so I'll put that to sidechain. And it'll be much quieter now. And there is a lot of low information. It's gonna muddy up our low end. I'm gonna take some of that out. I want this to be really wide, so I'm going to add some stereo enhancement to it as well. That one is Atmo break. Okay, so I might actually take the stem and put it somewhere else, but for now, I'm just going to have it pretty quiet. I'm going to add some reverb to it as well because it doesn't really have any reverb. Like I said, the track's not totally written, so there are some discrepancies that I have to address later on, but I just want to get to the mix first. This fire synth comes in a little bit later in the track down here. Like an accent, so it doesn't need to be too prominent. Okay. These are pretty prominent effects. They already have a bit of reverb on them. I'm just going to add a tiny bit just to sit them a little bit more comfortably in the mix. Very, very, very slight. Almost not even noticeable. Just to give them a bit of a tail so that they can sit a little bit longer after the drop there. This is where I start to get excited because I'm about to put it back into stereo. I'm going to save my progress first. And when you drop this, now that I've got like the first kind of balance going on, I've gone through all my stems for the most part. We can go back and you drop it into stereo and it just sounds so much better. So we'll listen one more time in mono, make sure everything sounds okay. And one thing I haven't done actually is use a reference track yet. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to grab a reference track just to make sure before we go into stereo that it sounds pretty similar to some of the other tracks that I have. Okay, so I have a remix that I'm doing here. I just have this one. I know that has a similar vibe, so I'm going to make sure I turn it down because it's not going to be the same loudness. And then before anything else, I want to check my headroom of my mix. So we're about -9 peak, sometimes -6, so it's a little hot. I'm going to check with my loudness meter before I start to make any more adjustments. And then I'm going to compare that to my master here. So I'm just going to listen to the master, make sure it's quiet so it doesn't blow my ears off. And then I'm going to open up the Uline loudness meter. I just click detach there so that when I click out of it, it's not going to close. If detached was off, then when you click out of the box, it goes away. So I just want to have it open so I can keep comparing in real time. So this is going to be the loudness meter, just to make sure the levels are accurate before I start comparing them. Actually, I guess I should do this track first, so let's do this one. Okay, so reading these levels here, we can see the LUFS here, and we can see, you know, the true peak and everything. So now we're going to go into our other track, and we're going to try and compare this volume with the volume of the other track, which is actually pretty close. This goes a little bit louder. A little bit louder. One more time, starting from 0. Okay, so they're pretty similar. This one's louder overall with the LUFS and the dynamic range, etc. But we can see that it's pretty close in terms of volume. The true peak is obviously different because we have this one already mastered. So now what we can do is compare the LUFS. So the LUFS of this one, it's already mastered. We're going to try and get closest to the LUFS as possible. And if you don't know what LUFS are, LUFS are the loudness unit full scale. So it's just another, it's a newer measure of loudness. Before we kind of just measure loudness based off of peaks, but now LUFS is more closely related to a perceived loudness, a perceived volume. So it actually sounds louder than it might show visually and it might peak at. So then we want to be getting as close to possible as the LUFS of a mastered track, because then when you do the mastering, it's going to bring those LUFS even higher. And the more LUFS you have, the more perceived loudness, but it's not always the best thing to do to get the highest LUFS. I try to get around -8 to -12 LUFS, depending on the genre that I'm writing or the genre that I'm mastering. I'd say, to be safe, personally, I'd recommend maybe 10 LUFS. A lot of professional mastered tracks for the underground scene are between 8 and 12 as well. So Spotify and streaming services sometimes are more accustomed to, like, they normalize your volume. It's not something I can get into right now, but a lot of people recommend maybe doing 14 LUFS for that. But for me, I prefer maybe around 10. Okay, and now just to show what I mean, so if we have this, I'm going to turn down the master volume here so we can see. But with this one full volume, it's actually mastered a little hot. It's a little, maybe 7.3, 7.4 LUFS. So it's actually a little bit hotter than I usually master, by almost a whole LUF. But then we go back to our original track. It's going to be much lower because it's not mastered. That's why we want to bring this volume down to where, you know, -21 where it was at. So if our track is at -21, bring this volume down until it's about -21. So that's perfect. And then what we do is we compare the loudness of this track compared to the loudness of this track. So if how our hat sounds in this track compared to how it sounds in this track, we reference both. So I'll turn the volume back up. So it sounds like the kick and bass are a little bit louder in this track. A little bit glued more together. Again, that could be the mastering, so we're just going to be careful with that. But all the other levels sound pretty good. I'm just going to turn, maybe, instead of turning the bass and kick up, because the master is getting close to the -6 that we want, I'm going to turn down the drums and sidechain just slightly. I'm going to drop them maybe just like that. And now, because we've dropped these down a little bit, by default or by, you know, contrast, these are a little bit louder. I'm also going to turn down the reverbs and the synths just a little bit. Okay, one more thing before I go into stereo actually is I'm going to start to drop the reverbs appropriately on all of my instruments here to send. So if I'm going to turn off all the other things but the drums, and I'm just going to go through, actually let's go individually and add reverb to each of the instruments. I don't want it to bleed into the next sound there, so I'm just going to do that. And I'm actually also going to add a bit of a choke on it because I don't want the reverb to go overlapping over and over again. So I'm going to add the open hat here. I'm going to add a sidechain compression to that. So what's happening is the reverb on the hat is going to be pretty loud. Let me turn it up a little bit. So the reverb is going to be pretty loud and have a really long tail. So to make sure that we're not kind of conflicting with the frequencies, I'm going to sidechain with the initial hit. And it is really, really quiet. So I'm going to turn up just a little bit more. And then I'm going to turn it down after. So it's really hard to see, but it's down there. It's really quiet. Do a really quick attack and a really, maybe like a medium release. And then I'm going to reduce this until we see a bit of gain reduction. So what's happening now is the reverb is, at this point, the hi-hat is punching through and turning down the volume of that reverb. And it's just so that it's not choking, or so that it is choking. It's kind of turning off the reverb of the hi-hat, or turning down the reverb of the hi-hat just for that quick transient of the hat to come through, so that the reverb of the long reverb of the drum of the open hat is not carrying through the rest of the mix while this hat is trying to punch through. And the benefit of that is that the open hat is making way in the frequency for the hat to punch through. So the reverb is going to be obviously muddying up the mix a little bit, so that when the open hat punches through and it turns down that reverb, it's creating room for the open hat to punch through without being kind of over processed and being drowned out by the open hat. I hope that makes sense. And the clap's a little bit loud, but I do like how punchy the rest of the drums are, so I'm going to turn it back up a smidgen. Perfect. And the bass seems a little bit quiet to me now, so I'm going to turn those both up. And I want to make sure that I'm compressing after as well. Cool. And let's go to the next drum. This has already got some reverb on it and some delay. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. And I could do the same thing with this. Maybe I'll just add a little bit of small reverb on it. Okay. Tambourine is later in the track. The tambourine sounds a bit sharp to me, so I'm going to EQ a little bit of the high end out, just a tiny, tiny bit. A little more. There we go. And we're going to push it a little bit further in the back in the mix because it's supposed to kind of be like an accent. So I'm going to turn this down a little bit actually more. And just kind of try and push it further back in the mix. Add a bit more reverb. That one's good. That one's good. That one's good. Probably turn this one up. So we'll turn that up. Maybe add a little bit of synth reverb, just a touch to kind of put it in the same room. Come back to that later. Okay. Everything else has reverb on it. Effect snare, yep. Okay. Now for the fun part, we get to take this out of mono and put it in stereo and see how good it listens, or how good it sounds. So let's hear it again in mono one more time. And stereo. Oh yeah. Especially if you're using headphones, that's going to be a huge difference for you. Okay, so a couple things I noticed is that the kick is a little bit lacking in punch, and we can fix that with some EQ and some compression. And the drums could be a little bit punchier in some aspects, and the lead is not very punchy. So I'm gonna have to go back and adjust the lead anyways, but for this video, okay, so that sounds good. This is going to conclude the end of studio session part 1. We're going to go into session part 2, and we're going to start to compress the drums and go from there. If you enjoyed this studio session and you want to see more videos like this, I'll be doing more Mixdown sessions, as well as just writing sessions where you can see how I actually create music. You can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Dowden or subscribe to the YouTube channel for more videos like this.